Coming up, for more than 20 years, he's helped groom Indigenous filmmakers at the Sundance Institute, and now Bird Runningwater is moving on. Find out what he's going to do next. Plus, the ongoing problems COVID-19 is having on Hawaiian tourism and business. We'll get an update. I'm Aaliyah Chavez. Join us for those interviews, plus headlines from Indian Country Today.
The Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication at Arizona State University is a proud supporter of Indian Country Today. Students at Cronkite News and Gaylord College at the University of Oklahoma cover Indigenous communities together. This important work is distributed by more than 100 news organizations. This collaboration provides a much-needed boost to coverage of Native American communities nationwide. Learn more at cronkitenews.azpbs.org.
This is Indian Country Today.
Amirawa Hopa, thank you for joining us. I'm Aaliyah Chavez. Money to spend in Alaska. Alaska Native corporations are deciding how to deploy $450 million in coronavirus relief funds to communities in need. In March of last year, Congress passed the CARES Act to send aid to tribal governments. Following a year of legal conflicts, Alaska Native corporations now have until the end of the year to spend the relief money. Some corporations told Indian Country Today they will spend the money through a combination of direct payments to shareholders and through community initiatives. Ethan Tyler is a senior director at Cook Inlet Region Incorporated. He and others are calling on Congress to extend the deadline so that initiatives are able to be sought through.
One of the things that people may not know is that it's not just spending the money that needs to happen before the end of the year, but any project that you undertake needs to be complete and in service by the spending deadline. So if that means expanding a facility or making renovations to a medical facility to address, the new needs of living among a pandemic, that has to be complete and in service by the end of the year.
Shareholders wishing to receive direct payments are eligible to apply for funds through an application process. Many of the applications are due in the coming weeks, with distributions set for late fall or early winter. In Albuquerque, New Mexico, officials plan to use ground-penetrating radar to search for the remains of students who attended a boarding school there. The Albuquerque Indian School was started in 1881 by the Presbyterian Church and was later turned over to the U.S. government. The city park is just a couple of blocks away from the school, where orange flags are placed to signify the importance of the site until more permanent plans are decided. The color orange is significant because it's used to symbolize the boarding school movement. The Commission on American Indian and Alaska Native Affairs has urged the City Council to acknowledge the history of the Albuquerque Indian School and its burial sites. The city said a public memorial event and additional meetings are planned in the coming weeks. In Southern California, the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians is announcing a new name change for its resort and casino. The new name is Yamava Resort and Casino at San Manuel. The name Yamava comes directly from the tribe's Serrano language.
Using a word from our native language, we honor our people, our community, and our ancestors in everything we do.
In December, the new resort and casino will open, which features more than 400 guest rooms and 100 suites. Two prominent Alaska Native organizations are working to save salmon in the Yukon River. In mid-September, the Alaska Federation of Natives and the Association of Village Council Presidents wrote a letter to the U.S. Secretary of Commerce. They are asking the Commerce Secretary to immediately declare a fisheries disaster on the Yukon River due to salmon populations. Salmon returns along the river have been in decline for more than a decade, and now advocates are saying the decline in fish has hit a level never seen before. AFN President Julie Kitka said in a statement, "Make no mistake, This is a disaster whether or not it's officially declared as such. When communities and economies are built on the dependability of salmon stocks, and those stocks go missing year after year, it's a disaster and a crisis. The state of Alaska has also joined the effort. A new 11-week course at Alaska Pacific University is teaching students land management from an Indigenous perspective. The title of the class is called Indigenous Land Stewardship: Creating Meaningful Collaborations Across Alaska. The idea is to have experts from Indigenous communities speak to the class. Students will also hear from leading leaders who collaborate with tribes and Indigenous organizations on science and conservation challenges. Alaska Pacific University President Dr. Hilton Halleck says it's inspiring to have Native leaders teaching land management. We are encouraged by partnerships like this, where tribal experts are the rightful leaders in teaching about the stewardship of this beautiful land. The course is offered virtually and is fully booked. It will begin on Friday. And those are the headlines for Indian Country Today. I'm Aaliyah Chavez. Coming up, for the past 20 years, Bird Runningwater has led the Indigenous film program at the Sundance Institute. Now he's moving on. Patty Tholahongva will talk with him about his time at Sundance and what he's doing next. And later, trying to get control of rising COVID cases in Hawai'i. We'll hear what the governor is doing to protect the islands. We'll be right back.
After 2 decades of service to the Sundance Institute as the director of the Indigenous Film Program, Bird Runningwater announced last week he is parting ways with the organization. Bird joins us today to reflect on his work and talk a little bit about what his future holds. Thanks for joining us today, Bird.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Well, think back, it's been more than 20 years. Think back to that first day that you walked into Sundance and you started your job. What do you remember about that very first day?
If I could go even further back, I started my career in media 25 years ago, and I happened to be at the first screenings, the world premiere of Smoke Signals, when I worked at a previous place, the Ford Foundation, and that was at the 1998 Sundance Film Festival. And that's when I first began to learn that Robert Redford and the Institute had a commitment towards supporting Native storytellers, Indigenous storytellers. And, just by chance, 2-3 years later, I ended up working there, but I knew it was a path that I wanted to pursue once I learned about the commitment.
And at the time, Sundance was getting started. And so looking at those early years, again, what was the thing that impressed you the most?
Well, I could really feel the commitment that was really held by the institution. I don't think many people know, but Robert Redford was mentoring filmmakers long before the establishment of Sundance Institute. He and his friends personally mentored and trained and invested in filmmakers. And I like to think that it's actually this support mentoring idea that really inspired him to create Sundance Institute. And so one of the things that I really appreciated the space that I was given when I arrived at Sundance was the opportunity to really rethink the investment strategy, the program, how the program would work. And that's when I realized kind of that, I think our filmmakers really needed, just kind of a culturally grounded space and model in order to do their best work and in order for their films to be the most successful.
And you mentioned, that how he'd been helping out Indigenous people before this program was actually started. Talk a little bit about the work that Stephen Lewis did and also Heather Ray.
Yeah, Stephen Lewis was actually the first Native staffer who's now the governor of Gila River, Governor Lewis. And he was the first curator back when Sundance Film Festival started a category called the Native Forum. And that was kind of the Institute's response to, the quincentenary, 1992 was kind of when all the 500-year anniversary of Columbus, arrival, and more like lost. He got lost really, but the Institute decided to create this category to really uplift, Native storytellers and Native films within the stage that the festival had. And so Stephen at the time was a grad student at UCLA in the American Indian Studies program. And so he was hired as the curator. And I believe he may have done maybe the first two festivals of curation, which I believe started in 1994. And then Heather Ray came on board, and she had been a producer, working with the late Phil Lucas, who's a Choctaw filmmaker, one of our great founders of our Native film movement. And so she came on board and began kind of not only curating for the festival, but also running the back then it was called the Native American Screenwriting Workshop, which was held in collaboration with the UCLA American Indian Studies program. And so when I first met Heather in 1998, and understanding her work and her investment on behalf of the Institute of Native Filmmakers. And so she kind of roped me in, and I began reading scripts for her and helping her, just kind of consulting in a way on the program until I arrived to work for the Institute.
Well, working in this very highly creative environment, your goals that you set for the program, let's say in the first 5 to 10 years, did you meet them?
Not in the first 5 to 10 years. I thought, this moment that, our community is having now, but we're on TV for the first time, shows created by us with all writers, all the directors, I thought that, when I first arrived at the Institute, that would happen within the first 5 to 10 years, but once I got deeper in it and I started understanding the resistance that the industry had to our stories, it really made me work harder, because you're fighting against a tide of lack of information, miseducation, if you want to call it, and misperception as well. I think, when Illuminative came out with their statistics, a couple of years ago, saying that 80% of Americans don't know anything about Native Americans and that we still exist today, like I recognized that 20 years ago, and you keep saying it over and over again. But when Illuminative's data came out, people actually were able to listen in a different way. So one of the things I tried to do was to really just buckle down and really try to mentor and nurture, a cadre of filmmakers, and to try to really build a global Indigenous community. Because when I was at the Ford Foundation previously, I had been doing global work in Africa, Asia, Latin America, Russia, across the US. And so I knew that there were Indigenous film communities in other regions around the world. And so when I got to Sundance, one of the things I wanted to do was to try to unify all of those worldwide global Indigenous film communities.
Well, and you mentioned, just this resistance to our stories, and then how long it takes for a movement to get off the ground, so to speak. So you mentioned smoke signals at the top, but in 2005, you were already helping Taika Waititi, but now it's taken how many years before he becomes this household name?
Yeah. Well, I have to say it's a difficult journey, I feel like, to become recognized as, a notable name in this industry. A lot of it is based on the economics of the industry. There are publicists and there are corporations and there's millions of dollars of marketing and spending that
It's a
go
big machine to
behind,
fight.
yeah,
Yeah.
uplifting all the names that we know. But I feel like Taika, his journey, he and Sterling Harjo both started out around the same time. And I watched their paths really advance in really different ways. And if I look at all the filmmakers that I've been able to support who are achieving some type of notoriety right now in this moment, they all had very different paths. But for Taika, he had a funding mechanism back in New Zealand where he could always go back to his home country and make his films for $2, $3, $4, $5 million, based upon, the New Zealand Film Commission and their own country's investment in films. Whereas Sterling, I feel like his advancement was really, hampered by, our capitalistic model in which everything is investment and return in terms of filmmaking, financing. And so
it's a tough environment.
Yeah, and he carried on. He kept making films while the budgets decreased, it seemed like, but he kept making exceptional work. That's a testament to a true storyteller.
Sure. Talk about some of the highlights in your career that you've had that that let's say you write a book. What's going to be, some of those chapters?
Oh my gosh, the memoirs. Well, I was actually talking to Sterling when he was in town for his Reservation Dogs premiere. But we actually thought, yes, there should be a book, but maybe we should start out with a podcast just to kind of start documenting things. We would have the official story. We would have the after dark version. We'd have the behind the scenes stories. I think we have enough for quite a few seasons. But I feel like, one of the things that was really important to me every time I went to Sundance Film Festival for us to host our event there, I would always call upon the Ute tribal nation, and I would always ask them, I would always acknowledge them in everything I did publicly, going way back to 2001, 2002. And then we eventually had, one of their drum groups, the Red Spirit Singers, join us every year for one of our events. And that was always really important to me for the space that I was in charge of within the festival. And so I was really proud that, 2 years ago, we finally elevated that acknowledgement across every screen in our festival and at every public event the festival was hosting, where we had videos, thanking the Ute tribal nation for allowing us, to be on their land. And I feel like that's one of the great achievements, along with just the cadre of filmmakers, I think, who have come through: Sydney Freeland, Taika Waititi, Sterling Harjo, Black Horse Lowe, Warwick Thornton in Australia, Rachel Perkins in Australia. So many talented voices who are now, creating amazing films and TV shows.
Well, you are not retiring. You are moving and transitioning into the business as it is. Tell us a little bit about Sovereignty.
Yeah, Sovereign. Well, we are still on that long road of development. It's like that's what happens with a lot of projects that are trying to make it to screens. It's like you get involved with these tiers of studios and networks and and streamers, and where a show is going to end up, and we're constantly writing, taking notes, revamping, and so right now we're still in the middle of that development process. So hopefully, we'll be able to get a green light on that one fairly soon. So hopefully it'll make it to screens.
So you're kind of joining the trenches of people, fighting to get your movie made.
Totally. Yeah. And it's also, like I am not going away. I am transitioning just to play a different role, I feel like, within our community. I feel like this is a time to make that jump and to hopefully make this beyond just being a moment, but to actually make it a cultural shift in our industry.
All right. And Bird, one last question. As you're doing these interviews, what's the one question you wish people asked you but haven't yet?
Gosh, that's a tough one. I guess people would ask why I guess I'm committed to this work. And one of the things I found is that this push and this fight for representation in our countries is really about, ensuring that our people and the original keepers of this land are acknowledged in all the fabric, of, the makeup of this country. That we have a long history of treaties and presence and creation stories and amazing moments, on our own lands. And those are the things that I want to be reflected in our American popular culture.
All right. Well, Bird Runningwater, thank you so much for joining us. Best of luck in your future endeavor.
Thanks, Patty.
And we'll be right back. last month, the governor of Hawaii asked tourists to not come to the islands. It was an effort to stop the spread of the coronavirus and the highly contagious Delta variant. It was also a blow to local businesses. Joaqlin Estus wrote about this tough request in her story, Good and Bad Days for Hawaii Businesses. And she joins us now to tell us more about the fallout from this request. Welcome, Joaqlin.
Well, thank you. It's good to be here with you. So Hawaii is an island state, and so it wasn't hard for them very early on in the pandemic to just completely shut down. They turned away cruise ships and airlines canceled a lot of flights, and Hawaii was at the top of the list in terms of keeping COVID at bay. And then last April, they started to open up, and rates of COVID went up and the hospitals were threatened with being overwhelmed. So Governor Ige issued that request asking people to stay away. And I talked with a couple of business owners. One is closing his doors. Another one said, Thomas Pua with Pua's Passion said that he thinks of his ancestors and how they went through the flu epidemic 100 years ago, the influenza pandemic, and that gives him faith that we can weather this one too. And then another business owner said most of his customers come from the local community, so he wasn't hurt too much at all. So Hawaii has it has a really good rate of a really good vaccination rate. It's at over 66%. However, there are some anti-vaxxers, and I saw a protest the day before yesterday with people marching in Kailua Kona and raising objections to government oppression and to medical recommendations to get vaccinated.
So it sounds like the governor's request has been met with good and bad. And one of the business owners that you talked to said he reacted too slowly.
That's right. That was James Bond with Eden Enterprises, the one who's closing his jewelry store. And he says that if the governor had held off longer and kept the strict restrictions in place, everybody, and then because what happened is people opened up, and that was a drain on their resources. They kept paying rent, they were at work, they weren't drawing unemployment, and it drew down their resources. And then shutting it down again meant the customers disappeared. And so he said if the governor had held out longer, everybody would have been better off. The other thing that's interesting about this, though, is that the state tracks the sources of infection, and tourists only contribute about 1% of the infections with COVID. About 20% comes from residents who travel to the mainland and bring it back. And then the largest source of infectious disease being spread is community spread. That means there are several people in the community that somebody could have caught it from. It's not clear exactly who the source was, but it was somebody, it's presumed to be somebody local, and that's about 70% of the cases. And one of the people I talked with said, the state had restrictions on the size of gatherings, and that was really hard on Hawaiian families. The woman I talked with has several, I think she said 3 kids, and she said that's 5 people and the limit is 10. If she just goes to visit her grandmother and some of her cousins and nieces and nephews, they're immediately over the limit of 10. And the state imposes fines for violations of the restrictions that they had put in place.
That's really hard because that's such the case in Indian country overall, that limit on how many people can gather. So in this case, for now, how long is the governor's request for limited travel? How long is that request in place for?
Until the end of October.
All right. And then hopefully by then we'll have some more information about maybe booster shots or something like that.
Well, actually, the state is just today started providing booster shots for anyone. So people can, they can get vaccinated, they can get a booster shot, and they can get their flu shot. So you can get, there's time. This is the time to do it. Everything is set up and ready to go and ready for people to come in and get their vaccinations.
Flu season is here, and that brings up another interesting point, because in all of this talk about vaccinations, it's been primarily about the coronavirus vaccine. So is there a push now to also get people vaccinated for the flu?
Yeah. And, one of the fringe benefits of all this is that people weren't, because everybody was isolating to stay safe from COVID, they weren't catching colds or the flu either. But now that we're mingling, we're back to all of that.
All right. Well, Joaqlin, Estus, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
And thank you for watching. Take care of yourselves. Your life is precious. I'm Patty Thalohungva. Join us again tomorrow.
Sometimes you got to take a stand just because you know you can. Oh, you got to run, you got to run.
This is Indian Country Today.